Welcome to Grounded Theory Unbound, a podcast about all things grounded theory. This podcast is hosted by the Veterans and Families Institute for Military Social Research at Anglia-Ruskin University. I'm your host, Dr. Nieke van Bechel, and in today's episode, I'm joined by co-host Dr. Hilary Engward. Together, we are talking to Dr. David Morgan. David is a professor emeritus in the Department of Sociology at Portland State University. He is a sociological and social psychologist who is widely known for his work on focus groups and started his grounded theory journey during his PhD research. More recently, David published a paper exploring the use of artificial intelligence for qualitative data analysis, the Case of ChatGPT, in International Journal of Qualitative Methods. The use of AI in research, and specifically in qualitative research, is a hot topic at the moment and will become more and more significant as time moves on. For this reason, David's paper fascinated me and led me to invite David to the podcast. So without further ado, I present Dr. David Morgan. David, again, thank you very much for agreeing to have this conversation with us. I think for the audience of this podcast, who are mostly grounded theorists, who may or may not be familiar with your grounded theory work and your wider qualitative work, would you mind giving a quick or a brief introduction to your background in qualitative research, because you're currently an emeritus professor at University of Portland?
Portland State.
Portland State, okay.
University, yes. Well, I did a qualitative dissertation, and because I'm emeritus, that means I'm old enough to be retired. So I completed that in 1977 and used a grounded theory approach in a field study, and eventually published an article out of that on changes in level of care for people in the retirement community. And I think I mentioned to you at one point that Kathy Sharma has asked me, how did you do such a good piece of grounded theory without studying with Strauss and Glaser and their students? So I treasured that memory that I actually managed to do a good piece of grounded theory without being directly in the University of San Francisco, University of California, San Francisco group. And best known for my work in focus groups, which I just got interested in what would it take to bring groups together in qualitative interviews, and analyzed those for years with intense coding. Got involved with using software for that with an early program called the Ethnograph in the 1990s. And so I have a lot of experience with not just hand coding materials, but using software to code them. So I've had a long-term interest in grounded theory, and I've developed an interest in pragmatism, which is the particular paper you were mentioning, really applying John Dewey style pragmatism to some elements in grounded theory. And of course, I think it's Anthony Bryant and Sharma herself were very interested in pragmatism. So I've sort of taken that to another step. But I just had some colleagues who were telling me all about their experiences with ChatGPT and asking me why I hadn't experimented with it. And when I did, I didn't want to just sort of sit there and ask it some questions. I wanted to see what it could do with some data. So I got one of my focus group studies, fed it into ChatGPT, and experienced what people call the wow factor. It was like, how can this thing analyze my data this well, this fast? And, particularly because I was very familiar with that data, I was, distinctly impressed with what came out of the machine. Yeah. So there's a little introduction.
It's fascinating stuff as to what it can do, even if it's in its earlier iterations, and it comes out really well in the paper. And the reason I initially contacted you was because of the paper, because it's just such a good, clear, accessible way of thinking about ChatGPT in qualitative research. So the paper we're referring to is your a paper that was published in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods last year, where you compared ChatGPT and data analysis with ChatGPT to your own personal human coding, if you will. What, other than the initial fear of missing out because people were asking you, why are you not doing it? Followed by, oh, now I'm really interested in this. What made you take that comparative approach in that paper?
Well, I am working on a small book called Thinking Thematically that I hope I have it out for review with a publisher. But in that book about, just the idea that we're going to, in general, produce results that are organized around themes. We say the data show 4 or 5 major themes. And so the book says, well, how do we analyze for themes? And I had done one chapter where I took a data set and put it completely through Braun and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis. And then I myself have a variant on thematic analysis. So I used a second data set in another chapter. And I just completed these very detailed analyses. So it occurred to me, well, what if I tried to do the same thing with ChatGPT on each of these studies? And, the answer is I could have saved myself hours and hours of work.
And now you're in the rabbit hole.
Yeah, but it's not all that dark down here. I can feel like I don't know where I'm going to come out for sure, but I'm happy in the rabbit hole.
What were your initial thoughts when you used, or when you started, shall we say, playing around with ChatGPT for that purpose?
Well, mostly curiosity, but I had this feeling that I've just done this detailed qualitative analysis. I mean, I was familiar with both data sets to begin with, but I had kind of done a rigorous analysis with each one. And my thought was, to what extent will it replicate this, what I've already learned? To what extent will I learn new things from it? Can it do this at all? I think was the main thing that I had. Is it just going to produce complete garbage? And but I had a standard to compare it to, having just worked intensely on these 2 data sets, and that's where I was just so surprised that it could, with great speed, reproduce the same things that I had worked so intensely to dig out on my own. So it was with a definite skepticism that I started.
And I think to a degree that's probably where, as academics, we tend to start, because how can a computer do our job better? But I think even Hilary is now semi-convinced. Following conversations we had earlier today, when I showed it, I had a transcript that I had just anonymized, and I thought, I wonder what happens, because they've just upgraded ChatGPT models. I wonder what it can do now. I ran it through. My mind was blown, and then I sent it to Hilary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I started doing some coding on one of those transcripts. And absolutely what ran through was a high level interpretation of the document fed in to be I think we need to be careful. Is it analyzing? Is that the right word to use? Is that what the program is doing?
Well, I think we're doing the analyzing, but the program is giving us, I think the key word you just used is interpretation. I said in the published paper that it primarily summarizes the data, but it summarizes it in a very interpretive fashion. I mean, if you ask it for themes, it will give you things that look like themes. And in classic grounded theory, at least some forms of it, if you ask to have those themes in gerund form so that everything starts with ing, it will give you some very convincing answers. Yeah, so I think people are debating, does it just summarize the data or does it interpret the data? And I think if you have a conversation with it, which is key, that it kind of iterates back and forth, that it becomes much more interpretive as you ask it what's in the data.
So it's an interpretive conversation we're having.
Yeah, it's if it doesn't actually interpret the data, it's sure right on the boundary of providing you with that. But I feel like, I don't take that for granted when it gives me that kind of information. I take that as sort of a starting point and ask it more questions, sometimes more detailed questions. Sometimes I dispute its interpretation a little bit. And if you've experimented with the program, it tends to be very polite. And it says things like, "Oh yes, I see," and "Now let me look at," and as if it really wants to have a polite conversation with you.
Absolutely, and I think that's probably the thing. As a researcher doing it in the manual sense, we are having those conversations anyway, aren't we?
Yeah,
But as you identify, it's over a longer time frame, in that
right.
considered time to understand your data. But as a grounded theorist, we should be constantly interrogating.
Right. Well, one of the classic things in grounded theory and most other coding, particularly if you're looking now at the new reflexive version of Braun and Clark's version of thematic analysis, the initial coding tends to be highly descriptive. The open or initial coding, it wants to have a process that keeps us from becoming too interpretive too fast. And as we take our initial codes and build them up and compare them to each other, that's a very slow process. And the question of whether or not ChatGPT can essentially short circuit that process by giving us pretty good initial interpretations of the data, I think is the big issue that we're looking at here. And it's going to have implications for just about any kind of data analysis that involves intense coding as a starting point.
I think you're bang on there, and it's the initial more. I don't like the word superficial, but the more descriptive, less conceptual finding of patterns is what it currently seems to be really good at and really intuitive at.
Yeah, and then it's like I said, there's this wow factor. It's kind of startling how good it is. And I'm not the only one who said that. Others I've heard with Hilary's experience, they fed a transcript in just to see what it could do and looked at the results and said, this is beyond my expectations. And so I really have a lot of questions about where that's going to take us, and whether it's really going to involve a different kind of thinking, that we would move away from Stefan Radker of Max QDA said, "Is this the end of coding?" Well, I don't know if you're heavily attached to Max QDA, and they are building a lot of ChatGPT into Max QDA, as is Atlas. And I talked to people at a conference I was just at, and NVivo is one step away from bringing it in. And so it's going to be a widespread option that you have. But whether you sort of do it in accompaniment or on top of coding, or whether you use it as a standalone process of analyzing data, is going to be a big question.
I think so, particularly if it starts to be being built into the major software platforms as per default, then we need to start thinking about where does it fit in and how is it going to fit in. And Hilary and I had a quick conversation this morning about this, and we came up with the notion of that once you've say manually coded something, then a quick run through an AI model like ChatGPT could be like a sense check. It could be a confirmation of I guess credibility, in the sense that am I making these things up, or does an AI which is effectively 100% objective, if that finds similar patterns, then am I onto something? So rather than using it from the start, use it perhaps in a confirmatory manner.
Yeah, and I've thought about that in the reverse direction you're talking about, is what if we start with the materials we get from the AI and work on that and get our best analysis that we can with the AI, which is probably going to take maybe a day or two, and then take those themes and conclusions that we get and go back to a standard qualitative data analysis program and code for those themes throughout the data, using the strength that that program has for coding and saying, sort of two things. Are these really in the data, and am I missing things in the data if this is all I have to start with? So sort of the confirmatory approach, but confirming what you found in the AI by going back and doing the equivalent of manual coding. So I think it could go either way.
That does sound a bit dangerous, though, because where do you then draw the line between presumption and preconceived notion going back to transcripts? Rather than, with the understanding, you never go into a transcript completely blank and without any baggage. But of course, if you have seen an AI do things, are you then more likely to look for those? Or see, that's a bit where I'm not 100% sure yet, because we can't be 100% certain how accurate the AI could be.
Right, but there's sort of two sources of inaccuracy, as I was trying to say you'd look for. One is the AI telling you things that you don't really code when you look at the data and try to code for it. It's a deductive approach then. You're beginning with prior notions, and if you can't find those in the data, you're in big trouble. Or if there are big spots of meaningful content in the data that didn't show up, then you're in trouble. But you do have to, in essence, make a coding system out of the AI responses and then attempt to, as systematically as possible, apply it. But again, it's reversing the traditional logic of going from codes to conclusions. The AI is giving you the initial set of conclusions, and then you need to ask, what do you want to do with them? Short of outright accepting them based on your familiarity with the data, which is the situation I've been in. I've been working with what I call legacy data sets, things I've analyzed very thoroughly before. But if you're just starting fresh, let's hope it's data that you've collected yourself, so you have that level of familiarity. It's probably going to be transcripts, and now everybody converts their audio recordings using AI into the transcripts, but you need to reread those transcripts and make sure that it hasn't messed up its translation of something somewhere along the line. But that, I think, would be the starting point. If you've collected the data, read through each of the transcripts carefully, and then feed them into the AI, that would be the starting point. And so that's how I'm looking at it now. And there are obvious questions about, how much familiarity do you need with the data? But then the other question I would have is, if you wanted this phrasing, do you need to be dragged through the data in order to interpret it? Some people say that without that immersion and without that in-depth contact and continual working and reworking the data, you won't get good interpretation. That hasn't been my experience.
I guess that's in the end, that's probably partially linked to how people see qualitative research in the first place, isn't it?
Well, and not just how they see it, but how they've experienced it. So how they
Yeah.
come to
Yeah.
see it. So, I mean, we could get deep into how the ideas of we have now for addressing data are themselves a social construction with a historical context. And that's this question of whether we're now at the point of a paradigm shift. Then suddenly we have this alternative available and we don't know what to make of it because we've all been socialized and trained into a very different world.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me to the next point, I guess, is where you said that, of course, all the whole set of qualitative research at the moment is kind of a social construct. But then if we compare that to the generative AI models we have at the moment, such as ChatGPT, they have been trained on data that were generated by humans with all its biases and inherent flaws and things that come with that. So how do we navigate that part? Because
Right.
that will, without a doubt, affect how the AI will find patterns in our data set, I would imagine, or how at least it words those patterns. But it's kind of a bit of a black box from that perspective.
Right. Well, there are a couple of things in there. One is the question of bias, and along with that, there's something called hallucinations, where the AI just comes up with material that doesn't exist, and it's just as certain of that as it is of anything else it reports. But most of that kind of thing, as far as I can tell, happens when you're querying the internet and trying to take that received knowledge. And so the bias is, easily found. Someone just gave me an example the other day. In fact, I hate to say it, but it was an AI that gave me the example. I have a friend who's working on bias. So I asked the Google program, Gemini, what about bias? And it said, yes, I have been guilty of bias, speaking in the first person. And it said that it had been trained to augment for racial diversity. And then someone asked it for images of Nazi soldiers, and it produced racially diverse Nazis. So you can get very strange results if you're querying the internet itself. But if you're only querying your own data, it is still, as you say, the pattern searching is based on what it's been trained on, but that pattern searching is such a generalized process that it, as far as I can tell, in the 3 data sets that I have of my own that I've analyzed in real depth, I have not seen a single instance of anything related to bias or hallucination. So I think we really need to make a distinction between when we're using these programs like ChatGPT on the internet in some unbounded way, as opposed to when we're specifically working with our own data. And then the other thing I heard you mention in there is the black box, and it definitely is a black box in terms of how it operates in there. And the reality is that the AI people themselves acknowledge that it's a black box. I mean, it's all based on taking words and paragraphs and sentences and chopping them up into probabilities of which word will follow which other word, but really getting those probabilities down to a very fine level by consuming as much of the internet as it can to be the basis for its pattern search. But how that works at the deep level is a black box to everyone. And you have to ask yourself, can you really accept that, as opposed to, how we've worked so hard to develop systematic ways of applying our manual tools. I mean, if we're doing grounded theory coding, we're not just marking up the data in any old way. We've got a long tradition of how to think about that kind of coding and how it should proceed, as opposed to saying, well, I'm going to accept the black box nature of the thing that produces my interpretations. That's a big leap.
Yeah, because it then goes towards that higher level interpretation, doesn't it? And the more conceptual way of looking at coding, and from coding to go to concepts, categories, or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
And I think that, and particularly also from a grounded theory perspective, there is the requirement to take into account context. And that's
Yeah.
probably quite difficult because an AI won't be context aware.
Well, it's not context aware because that's your job. You are still, the AI expression is you have a human in the loop. So as you read what it puts back, of course, you think about it in context because you know your data. And the next question you ask should be more based on your understanding of the data and whether the machine can tell you more about it, including your own assumptions. And just because of how I've been more recently trained, I tend to refer to themes instead of categories or whatever. But you look at what it says, and then you say, "Can you tell me more about what it means to say?" Now that's what I've kind of, when you write your queries or prompts, I try to avoid referring to the machine as you. Tell me what you mean when you say this is an important theme. And instead, I say, tell me more about this theme and how it applies to the data. But that's just because I really want to try to avoid anthropomorphizing the machine. Uh, and it will react. If you don't call it you, it will not call itself I. But if you refer to it the other way, it kind of knows what kind of conversation you want with it. Although again, I say it knows something. I try to resist that. It does something, and the way it does it responds. It doesn't know anything.
So it strikes me from, and this is a learning conversation for me, David. This boils down to the integrity of the researcher,
Yeah.
in the sense that how this technology is applied is only firstly as good as the researcher and the research itself, but secondly, how it is the researcher interrogates and asks questions of what the researcher is doing, but also what they're doing with the data to make sense of that data.
Yes, yes, yes.
Right. To me, it is very much a conversation and an interrogation. And people, I think, initially were talking about AI as an assistant. I've just been back from a conference where several people were using it and everyone was talking about it. And those of us who were using it were tending towards the word collaborator. Uh,
Wow.
I think of it, there's a process of co-communication where literally you're asking questions, you're getting answers, you're querying those answers. I'm a little bit queasy about the word collaborator. That might go a little further than I want, but assistant definitely stops short of how we use it. So I think we're really just beginning to wrestle with those issues.
Mm. And I guess one concern or thought that I have that we need to think ahead for is how we prepare people to engage and use this technology sensibly and intelligently.
Yeah. Uh, One way I heard that discussed, and it may take us too far off topic, but it is, how do we teach students about
Yeah.
this? The process of working with coding is very much a hands-on instruction, and it requires not something that you can probably read a book on, although closer to that than we were a generation ago. But it's a time-consuming process, but very much a mentoring process to teach coding and different kinds of coding and the progression from data to theoretical categories and how that occurs. And how in the world do you translate that into a world where you just ask questions of a machine and then try to decide the extent to which you should accept the answers the way they come at you, or the extent to which you need to engage in further interpretive work? And that is, I think, a big question. It's one we have to ask ourselves as we're trying to train into this new world. But again, if it it simplifies things and cuts down the time. Well, that's wonderful for us, but how do we, immerse students in that process? It literally requires you to be a good interpreter to begin with so that you can evaluate what the machine is telling you. But if you're a beginner, what does interpretation mean at all? What are the boundaries of it? How do you pursue it? Um, those are big questions that we're going to have to deal with if we go down this road.
It's almost like we're going to have to think very differently about how we pedagogically prepare the junior
and
novice
I had
researcher.
very interesting conversations with people about that. And you know what, I presented a paper on it, and that was one of the first questions I was asked. And I talked to one of my colleagues who's used earlier forms of AI pre-ChatGPT, and we kind of brainstormed about how he does it. And it's just something we will need to develop for people who are new to this in any regard. And it goes back to, I think, the question of what about people who are entrenched in coding? Will they find this to be acceptable at all? Or will they be able to kind of adapt their thinking of literally having their own conversation with the data when they're coding? Because to me, coding is not interpretation. Coding is more descriptive. And then there's a process where we move into something that's much more interpretive based on our coding. But, that's then again the question of how do we become effective interpreters of our data? And that's very difficult to put into a teaching framework, except through show and tell. This works better than that. Oh, no, that's too big a leap. Or, oh, no, you need to push this a little further than you have so far. I can do that with students where I'm looking at their transcripts and their coding, but I don't know yet how to do that with, their conversations with the AI.
I think that's probably part of the fact that it's really, really early days still. I mean, I think ChatGPT started in 2022, give or take. But one of the things that I mentioned is black box earlier. One of the things that strikes me is that the coding part of this data analysis journey is a really visual thing, because you have a transcript in front of you and you can see the words, and you work with the words, and you put labels on them to create those codes. Whereas if you interrogate an AI or interrogate that transcript using AI, that very visual aspect of the coding and where it all comes from, and particularly from a grounded theory perspective, the word grounded literally comes from being able to trace it back to the original data. Do we still see that if we use an AI to help us with that?
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, we've used the phrase several times today, manual coding. And of course, if you're using, Max QDA, Atlas, and Vivo, you're not doing manual coding, but you're not that far from the old style where I used to leave a wide margin on the right-hand side of the page, and I would mark and write in there. And some people used colored markers. And what most of we have for computerization today is essentially, much more complex versions of that. But again, mark and retrieve, and we slowly build up to the kinds of things we want to retrieve. Well, let's say if we're doing grounded theory, we do that. If you're doing something more content analytic, you'd hang codes on there that you wanted to be able to search immediately. But we evolve our coding system to the point where we begin to have much more consolidated codes and things that we feel confident that we can do theory building from them, rather than the initial open coding. But where that's going to go, I have to say I just got a negative review on a paper, and what they said is, why don't you tell us how ChatGPT can be applied to grounded theory or to reflexive thematic analysis or to interpretive phenomenology? Smith's IPA version. And literally it's one of those reviews that said, why didn't you write the paper I wanted to read? which was not very helpful. And I think if you're going to talk about forms of analysis where your results, I can't say emerge, that's kind of a dirty word, but somehow you get your results out of a coding process, which you very much construct the results. But I don't mind emergence so much as I think of myself doing the work to get those ideas to emerge in my own mind. So, Nikki, you'll know from my paper on pragmatism that I believe in abduction, but the ideas of abduction have to come from somewhere, and that immersion in the data that produces insights that you then pursue and try to make sense of is the way I pursue it. So, but again, that's going to be this question of the machine sort of does a lot of the quote emergence for you. It pops up tentative answers to your questions, and then you need to decide, is that something that really matches what I've encountered in the data, or is that something that I really need to ask more about? And I'll give you an example of one place where the machine really gave me insights I hadn't had. And it's in that first paper, and I've thought more deeply about one of the things that had happened, but it gave me a result that I said, oh, that's not a theme, that's too descriptive. And I don't want to go into the whole story, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought of, what it's describing? It's describing a really much more complicated and interesting phenomenon, and it's a theme in this data that I never thought of. And so it gave me a whole basis for reinterpreting something based on, I thought there were like 5 things in there, and it gave me a 6th that I really too early discarded because it wasn't familiar. It didn't match my previous thinking. So instead of querying myself and saying, why are you rejecting this? Why have you never thought of this? What does it really imply? I just said, no, I know what's in this data, and that's not important. Yes, it's all over the data. I know that, but it's really descriptive. It's not important. And then I said, wait a minute. There really are ways that this is important. It isn't just a little specific problem that people describe. It's representative of a much bigger issue that's in the data that I hadn't paid enough attention to.
Yeah. And I think, but this is where we go back to what Hilary said earlier about if we think of this in the context of, say, postgraduate research education and early career researcher training, having that awareness of, hold on a minute, I need to take a step back here, or I need to push on the brakes here for a little bit. That's the bit where I can see this go really wrong.
Yeah, I agree. And I particularly worry about early stage researchers that way. It's like, if I can look at that and discard it without enough thinking and enough mental processing, then what about somebody who hasn't wrestled with data as much and haven't, I do like to think that somehow if we have to get it down to our 3 or 4 basic categories. I'm not one of those people who believes in a core category myself, but depending on what kind of grounded theory you're doing, you may need to have a core category. But the question is, how do we build that understanding both for ourselves and our students? And how do we begin to transfer the kinds of mechanical work that we've done in the past to the kind of more literally intellectualized work that we'll have to do with ChatGPT. I don't think the issue is how do we develop ChatGPT so that it can help interpret phenomenological analysis. It's more how do we begin to rethink our standard procedures in IPA or grounded theory so that we can apply the computer most effectively.
Yeah. It requires an additional skill set, doesn't it? So in addition to all the things you would normally have to do as a qualitative researcher, irrespective of which methodology you adhere to, there is the additional skill of being able to use an AI as an effective tool in a sensible way.
Yeah. And I think what may develop from what I've seen of some of my colleagues doing is different ways of using the machine. So that in that second paper, the one where my critical reviewer really wanted me to not develop my own way of using ChatGPT, which is what I did, and instead wanted me to develop applications for something else, that's my way of doing it. But I think others are going to evolve very different ways of doing it, and we'll have 2 or 3, hopefully fairly clearly distinct ways of using the computer and saying, okay, which one of these is preferable for your particular purpose? And so instead of just thinking that, okay, here's this black box in your hand, put something in it and take whatever comes out of it, we'll have Morgan's way of doing it versus someone else's way of doing it, and you'll have to choose and justify one of those for your given purpose. But it's going to take a while before we evolve those different analysis styles.
And then,
yeah.
So, but and then we're kind of back to the methodological debate, aren't we? You find your purpose for your research, and once you know your purpose, you choose the approach that works for you. Now, if that is an approach that involves an AI, great. If that is an approach that doesn't involve an AI, also great. And then we're back to basics, just at an enhanced level, because we have an additional tool in our arsenal.
Yeah.
Right, and we'll have to refine the ways we apply that tool. And it's because it's such a multi-use tool, it can be really applied in different ways, and we're going to have to sort out what are the interesting ways of doing that. And so I have my initial suggested way of doing it, and I think others will come up with very different styles, and hopefully those will get kind of formalized so that you say, okay, if I'm going to use this tool, I can use it this way. Or we may think of it, to revise the analogy a little bit, as the AI providing you with its own toolkit. And you say, okay, within these possibilities, I'm going to use this one for this reason.
And so it feels very, sorry, Nikki, it feels very much, again, this is coming back to, it's a checking of the I. Again, our I as the person doing the research.
Right.
It is my it's my ethical responsibility to to inquire into a phenomena in a responsible way. But similarly, it's my responsibility to analyze my data in an ethically responsible way as well, and that involves that sense checking, that conversation with. But also asking questions of myself, as in, how am I intentionally using this application?
Yeah, and thinking of yourself as an active interpreter, that what you're going to give your readers is some balance between what was in the data and what you heard from your participants, and then how much of it is your own interpretation of that. And that's a question I've wrestled with quite a bit. And I think as qualitative researchers, we're always asking ourselves how much of this is in the data and how much of it is in me. It's kind of an unanswerable question, but as you say, we try to be as ethical as possible about that. We can't eliminate the me, the I that's doing the analysis, but we need to be respectful as possible to our participants and their story that we're retelling now as our story, the story we're telling our readers.
And yeah, indeed, we should always be doing that as it is. Oh, we've lost Nikki.
Have we lost him?
He must have dropped off there. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting take on it. And I think it's an important take, because that is incumbent on us to be leading, to ask those questions. And these are questions we ask of our early career researchers anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So these aren't new questions, but they are questions in relation to a different type of application, I guess.
Right. the questions aren't going to go away, but do we have a set of techniques and things that we impose on ourselves that keep us thinking about those questions as opposed to, quote, getting easy answers. And,
Yeah.
And it may be that the other way to think about that is there are easier ways to get the answers than what we've been doing. That's where we get into the idea that this would be such a paradigm shift or a revolutionary change in how we do and even think about what we do that is both exciting to some people and frightening to others.
I'm excited to explore this in probably a different episode, but what this means in relation to the researcher identity. I do research, I do funded research. And this will really change the dynamics of what it means to be a researcher.
Right. And I think at some level for doing funded research, it'll still being able to demonstrate that you have mastered this process. Perhaps you have publications with it, that you are bringing the necessary skills to it. I mean, I always think that what the funder wants to know is if they give you the money, will you actually be able to use it effectively? And what proof do you have of that? And so we'll still be in that same loop. But one of my colleagues at this conference I was just at, half jokingly, but on another level, very seriously referred to herself as a cyborg researcher. So where the cyborg is the merger of the human and the machine, that now, after all these years, she's become much more deeply attached to the machine than she ever was with the manual coding. That was still a translation of something that she knew from her own entirely human experience, that the machine very much is an assistant when you're working with traditional qualitative data analysis, survey, those kinds of platforms and programs. And now she feels like she's a very different kind of level of merger with the machine. So I'm trying to put together an edited collection about people's early experiences with qualitative data analysis, and I think her chapter would be the experiences of the cyborg researcher.
That is a title. That is a title. A cyborg researcher. I love it. I love it. We're gonna have to sell that within our institution. Do you want to become a cyborg researcher? If so, sign on the dotted line.
Yeah.
And I'm also curious in exploring more about, especially in relation to grounded theory, this idea of how this technology is useful or prohibitive in moving from the description to the conceptual.
Yeah, exactly. And when I say it involves a lot of familiarity with the data, that you can't do it without an intense level of familiarity with the data, that means that you know the data in a descriptive sense. And I think truly you've already in an interpretive sense as well, that we can't deny that we're doing that. We can't take so many steps away from the data that maybe in like very early phenomenology, we're going to bracket out everything that's meaningful about ourselves and look at the data totally descriptively. But we have to be very familiar with that descriptive aspect of the data before we can evaluate the interpretations that the machine gives us. And I tell my students when they're doing focus groups, when does analysis begin? The first time someone says something in an interview that makes you think. And you go, oh, that's interesting. Or it may be, I expected to hear that. But anyway, you've begun your analytic process by having an interpretive response to something someone says. And then we have to, again, be careful about over-interpreting too quickly. But I think that we may have resisted that impulse to such an extent that we've kind of overdone it with some of our coding procedures. But that's just my personal opinion. I may be a little more averse to coding than other people who really enjoy that.
And just, so I'm obviously conscious of time, and we've got you here. But I know you mentioned about how you interrogate the dialogue you're having with the machine.
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us a little bit more about the types of questions you ask of it?
Yeah, well, my initial questions are really, I start with 2 or 3 general questions that summarize the research question. And I can't just say I tell it what the data is. These are 6 focus groups that come from a study of. And then I ask it, what would you say are the 6 major themes that these participants discuss? So something that vague, it can give me decent answers. But then I'll repeat some of with the research question attached and say, this research was intended to look at the question of blank. What do you think these people had to say about that question? And then I'll even go in and use the interview questions themselves and say, what did participants tend to say about question 1? And put all that together in my mind and look at the answers it gives me and say, gee, which of these sets of themes looks best? Which one looks too long? And I can say, you gave me a list of 6 themes. If you could reduce this to 3, what would they be? Or you only gave me 3. If you could give me a longer answer, what would that be? And so I spend a fair amount of time with it at a broad level until I feel like I've got a set of themes that are really worth pursuing. So I'm glad you asked that, because it gives me a chance to sort of portray the way that I get into the data, which is not just to ask one question and accept one set of answers.
Mm-hmm. It is this constant interrogation, and it's almost a push and pull of what it can tell you about the different dynamics within your data that one person may not see.
Yeah, those are very good descriptives of what it's like.
I guess some of the conceptualization that we mentioned earlier, it sits in that interrogation, doesn't it? So where the AI can't do it for us, you're constantly interpreting poor English, interpreting what it gives us back, and kind of conceptualize that before you then rephrase what you want it to do next. So is it just a matter of that conceptual level sitting on the other side of the fence?
And that's where that idea of it being a collaborator comes in. It reacts to you, but you react to it. You can't just, like with any, the good thing about a collaborator is that they can spur your thinking in ways that may not have happened, or they can help you reinforce things that you both see in the data, but you work back and forth to come together in that collaboration. You don't just throw things out on the table and look at it and then throw something out on the table. It's a very much more dynamic process than that. I don't know, it's almost as if you have a team member there that you have to accommodate them as well as they need to respond to you. But again, that's kind of anthropomorphizing. I really keep trying to back away from that and saying, that there is a machine in there that doesn't know anything about these data. The one thing we can say that we haven't mentioned yet is a little bit. I said that it's responsive to you and it learns about you. It really does, and it learns about your analysis interests. The more you ask it questions, it keeps that in context as it answers the questions by doing an internal process of learning, which is really kind of spooky. What I do in my analysis is I frequently clear that out. You can re-enter the data. So that when I gave that example a little bit ago of saying, oh, I just ask it for themes, or I ask it the research question, or I ask it the interview questions, I clear the memory every time before I do that so that it doesn't remember the prior answers it gave me.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, otherwise it builds on what it's done before. No one has any idea how that works, but it does. So, and it can be very positive if you want to continue the analytic conversation and go deeper into what you feel confident in exploring that you've already established. Otherwise, if you really want to compare three different versions of what the machine would tell you, then you need to clear the memory each time.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking from this, is this ethical?
Is it what?
What are the ethics of this, David?
Well, I think the big issue that people have explored around ethics is privacy, particularly. And
Mm.
IRBs, your review boards, your ethics committees are very concerned about this. And I think one of the consensuses I had with my colleagues at this conference I went to, those of us who had used ChatGPT, is that most of those concerns are overdone. And for two reasons. One, you can turn off the data scraping in ChatGPT and keep the conversation private and not have the data taken into its database. So that's what people are always worried about, is that even if you've anonymized the interviews, that somehow the machine is so hungry for new data that it will take yours. No, you can turn that off. And number two, it doesn't really take the data in a literal sense. What it does in technical terms, which I don't understand, is it vectorizes the data. And when I tell people that, I say, really, it means it pulverizes the data. All it cares about is pairs of words and chunks of words, and you could no more get that interview back out of ChatGPT. I use the example of a Wikipedia article. All these different programs absorb Wikipedia really fast because that's a really tremendous example of good English prose. But you couldn't tell it to give me the Wikipedia article on, I don't know, say Manchester United football team or something like that. You could tell it, write an article on, that in the style of Wikipedia. And it could do that brilliantly, maybe even better than the Wikipedia article itself, but it couldn't reach in there and pull out the original article. All it has is little strings of words and chunks of text. And so it's essentially gone once it scrapes it, and you can prevent it from absorbing it or scraping it anyway. So as we learn those sorts of things, I think, we'll settle down to the point where if the data is thoroughly anonymized, that's as usual good enough. But that consensus is the opinion of someone who really has a self-interest. So what will happen with the privacy issues and particular ethics committee and ethics review is something else. But there are probably other ethical issues beyond that, but that's what I hear people talking about the most right now.
Mm, mm, mm. I think that's interesting to hear about. As a novice of this type of technology, I think one of my early thoughts was, ought participants be aware that their words, anonymized,
Right.
will be used to inform machine learning?
Right. Yeah. So we can prevent it being used for machine learning.
Okay.
And it's not clear to me that, some people say you can never thoroughly anonymize your data enough that people can't be identified. But within limits, I think, you can, get it down to the point where somebody told me that if the police want your data, they're going to get it. And I don't think that they're going to get it through ChatGPT for a couple of reasons. But, that's another whole set of issues.
So, David, before we finish our chat together, as that novice AI user in relation to my academic world, what are the top 3 tips I should know, or that you would advise for me?
What would I advise for you?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things is that this is an extremely fast-moving area. And what we need to remember is that our goal is not to master ChatGPT 4, 4.5, or 9.0.
Mhm.
Our job is to communicate with our colleagues and to write in a way that they understand what we did and why we did it. And I think one thing that's going to help with that is we're already seeing these programs being built into the existing platforms, and we can begin to look at our data simultaneously in coding software and in ChatGPT. And so that is a way to go. If you have data you've already coded or are coding, you can simultaneously use the ChatGPT with it and see how informative that is. But the next step that I see out there is people already developing programs that are specifically for qualitative researchers, and to say, okay, given the kind of platforms we're familiar with, how would we take that directly into ChatGPT? How would we do things like building comparative variables or categorizing our respondents and say, I want to see how men talked about this versus how women talked about this, or how people who had experienced this program, this intervention and program talked about it, as opposed to people who continue, to deal with it in a control group sense, whatever that is. So the things that we now know very well how to do in terms of categorizing our respondents, if you will, participants, we'll be able to do that very easily in a ChatGPT framework. We'll be able to give it good context about the kind of research we're doing. We'll be able to separate out participants in focus groups if we want to. All the things that the programs allow us to do now will be the front end of a ChatGPT conversation. And we'll be able to directly enter our interviews and work with familiar data in a familiar way. So I think that's the next generation of thing that's coming out. You won't have to learn what ChatGPT does or doesn't do, that this
Mm.
will automatically make your data private and other things like that. So I think that will make a real initial difference, because right now you do have to be something of an experimenter and a technology lover to go out and put your data into ChatGPT. Haven't really even needed to talked about, what does that involve? But I joke that I pay some guy in China $20 a month to put a program interface on the front of ChatGPT so I can put long transcripts in there. Until recently, it wouldn't accept as much data as a single transcript unless you knew how to program the data input. So I have somebody else who's doing that for me for a fee. Well, once these other programs get out and on their feet and start competing with the standard qualitative data analysis software, well, it'll be much easier for any qualitative researcher to just bridge the gap by having data and putting it into a fairly familiar environment. So that's what I'm looking forward to at this point.
I'm going to save you some money there, David. So this morning I fed a 26-page transcript into ChatGPT and it was perfectly happy with it.
Right.
So I'm going to try and push the limit now, but since they've
Probably,
upgraded it.
ChatGPT 4.0 will allow you to
Yeah.
do that, I think.
Yeah,
So
you can upload it directly as a PDF.
yeah, that's good. So, yeah, you're right. So I don't have to pay for that anymore. One of my colleagues at the conference told me that. I said, oh, that's good. Yeah, so save me some money,
Save
please.
you some money there. Thank you so much, David. It's been thought-provoking. There are so many different things that I want to go and explore. I need to go and sit down somewhere and actually figure out what I want to do next. I'm really looking forward to seeing your query-based paper, your query-based assessment or analysis paper rather, in print, because I've got the sneak preview, but it's going to be interesting to see in print, predominantly to see what the response of it is going to be.
Yeah, I think that I would make an analogy to what you just said about you have things to look at and ways to think about it that, you know, it's not like I want to say quite all of us do, but as a field, we're going to confront this. It's not going to go away. Now, we may reject it for good reasons. I don't know. But it was just astounding to me at this recent conference how much interest there was, how much experimentation with it there was, that people are saying, this is just totally relevant to what we're doing, and we're going to have to, as I say, confront it.
Yeah, I agree. There's no way around it. There's no way without it. It's going to happen, so we might as well learn how to drive it properly.
Yeah.
And that's why we have these conversations.
Exactly. And this was a very good starting point. So thank you very much, David, for that.
Thank you. As usual, you say thank you for having me, but I've really enjoyed expressing some of these thoughts. That's great.
I feel like I missed out on not going to this conference. I would have probably got my nerd on there.
Well,
probably more so than Hilary at this point, but yes.
The conference that very much emphasizes performative qualitative research, if you know what that is, where you summarize your findings, if you will, in a performance rather than a paper. Yeah. And so those folks are probably not at all interested in ChatGPT, but those of us who still think about data and results and findings and empirical research are fascinated with the question and the problems that it presents to us.
Yeah, it's ever fascinating. This was Grander Theory Unbound. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you have any feedback, or if you would like to feature on the podcast to talk about your way of doing grander theory, please get in touch with us using the details in the show notes. Tune back in next month for our next episode. Bye!